Welcome, everybody. We're talking about spring and summer produce pairings. We will talk a little bit about what else might come along with that. We'll talk about some other fun spring cheeses, of course. We'll talk about the great spring meats that really come out this time of year too, right? We think about lamb, we think about rabbit, we think about poussin. In a few months, we'll be talking about snails coming from Burgundy. You can't harvest them right now until about June because it's their breeding season, but we'll be talking about escargot. So many fun things. Scott, I don't see Angelique with you, but I mean, this class is designed with her in mind because she is such a vegetable eater.
She will be here momentarily. She's actually just
perfect. Perfect. So while we're kind of waiting for other people to sign in, we can of course go through a little bit of the philosophy. We thought it would be really fun to have a class during the day to celebrate mothers, of course, but also kind of the beautiful bounty of the earth changing right now. I do want to say kind of, even at the risk of being a little bit introspective and too romantic, I really feel sort of the awakening and the re-emergence of the earth this spring. I don't know if anybody else feels the same way, but we're really coming out of this slumber over this past winter from COVID, from the cold weather here in New York. And I really feel the abundance that nature is kind of giving us at this time. I think it's really exciting, right? Kind of a new, fresh beginning for New York and other places. So a couple of fun things we'll do today. I recommended that you put yourself together a snack plate. This is just mostly because wine should go with food. They belong together. They complement each other. They make you want to have more of each. So I just kind of went through my fridge and I wanted to focus on having something salty, something acidic. Actually, I think I forgot to grab my acidic, something with maybe sweetness to it, which I actually don't have in my house right now, something fatty. So I just kind of went through and got like a bunch of things. I'm not going to eat on camera because I've tried it before. It's not a good look. It doesn't turn out that well, but I encourage you to. And the point of this is not to say, I want you to try an olive with this particular wine. Hi, Angelique. But the point is just to have the saltiness, the acidity, the fat, the sugar, and etc. to kind of go along with the wine so that you can at home experiment with some of these structural pairings as we discuss them. So I just have some olives, they're a little like salty, briny, and fatty, right? These are some dried mushroom snacks with a little seasoning on the outside. I have a little kind of fresh camembert. This is from Ronnie Brook Farms from upstate New York. Really nice, smells like kind of mushroomy, but also really grassy. Cheeses really have a seasonality to them. There's a reason sometimes you eat maybe, a cheese or maybe a piece of meat and you're like, gosh, it doesn't really taste like much. It could just possibly not be the right season for it. I have a little sopressata. This is a kind of a sweet one, so it's not as spicy. A little kind of smoked mackerel. This would be really good with like a Riesling, something a little bit off dry. A little bit of sea salt. This is smoked. It's from the Aquavit. I went there earlier this week for dinner. They sent us home with a nice little tin of smoked sea salt. You might try something a little spicy to see how that works. This is a Momofuku chili crunch. You can tell we've been supporting our local restaurants in New York this past year, buying all the pantry staples that they have to bring home. You also might have some soy sauce, though. I mean, can't really see it, but anyway, it's just kind of all on the side. This is to give you an idea of what you might just run to the fridge and put together whatever you have. In terms of something acidic, you could grab anything with lemon. You can grab a lemon, a little bit of vinegar. You might think about like salt and vinegar potato chips, which are both salty, fatty, and acidic, right? They're giving you like the holy trinity right there in that. That's why they're so good. That's why you eat the whole bag, because everything is intense about that, but the intensity level of each part of that, salt and vinegar potato chip is balanced. So we'll get into all of that. Now we're not doing the whole have a sip of this particular Chardonnay with this type of heirloom buttered popcorn because we don't all have those exact ingredients at home. I say it over and over. It's really great to go to a restaurant that's doing a tasting menu with wine pairings where they have vetted the actual wine with the actual ingredient, right? They tasted all of these things together, but it would be much more difficult for us to mimic those exact pairings at home. One, to recreate that dish, maybe to get that wine at the same vintage or bottling, and also to make sure that all of those ingredients are in season. So here we are. That's my fun beginning. Please chat with each other as we go along. If you have moms on here, if you're going to talk to mom later today or tomorrow, please feel free to use the chat box to talk about your favorite pairings, your least favorite pairings. Maybe you vehemently oppose something that I'm suggesting in terms of a pairing, and please feel free to talk about it in the chat box. We always love to hear from everybody. I always really love beginning to sort of research these classes. I've taught enough of them. I have a kind of a fun base for understanding the material for a lot of these classes, but it is so much fun for me when I spend that extra day or those few hours before class, really kind of looking into either new material or remembering material I've learned before. It's something that's really special for me to do that and then share it with you. So we're talking mostly about produce today, not entirely, but we are talking about food and wine pairing. And I know that a few of you have been to some of our recent classes that we've done on food and wine pairing. We did a chocolate and wine class, of course, around Valentine's Day. We did a cheese class recently, but we haven't done one with produce and meat in a while. But I will be repeating some of the things that we've talked about in those other classes. And this is not with the intention of being redundant. This is because they're the things that we need to know at home and remember to naturally make food and wine pairing work, right? So the first thing is experiment. That's why I told you, get whatever you have in the fridge, put together a plate, go ahead and go crazy at home, playing with your different food and wine pairings. Today, I'm also going to talk about two specific wines that we're tasting. I have them both poured. One's a Gruner Veltliner, one is a Rosé. But I'm going to, towards the end, recommend wines that are probably more accessible in every market. So I could sit here and do a whole class on how perfect Gruner Veltliner and Rosé are for pairing with spring and summer vegetables. But if you can't find those wines in your market, I've actually done you a disservice, right? So those of you that have these wines, they're absolutely fantastic. They're female wine producers that we really stand behind. But we'll also talk about Riesling, Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, Cabernet Sauvignon, even Pinot Noir, and I think Syrah. So we're going to talk about some of the kind of top 6 wines that you might find. So let's just talk about the experimentation. This is a good thing. It's okay to experiment and taste something that you don't like. This is even how we determine our own palate when it comes to enjoying food, right? We try things, we understand if we like it or we don't. We should experiment, we should try classic pairings so that we understand why they work. And then we can say, I do or I don't like that. And you can learn how to pair things to your palate, right? We tend to use some basic rules as guidelines that we'll go through. We say rules because rules are meant to be broken, right? Because everybody has their own individual palate. If you love a wine or you have a wine that you want to showcase at your meal, let that take the lead. You can maybe prepare food to go with that, that will really let the wine shine and be the focus of the meal. Maybe you want to share a favorite family recipe with some friends that are coming over for dinner. In that case, you really want that dish to be the focal point of the conversation, right? So you would choose a wine on the side that's not going to overwhelm or overpower the dish or the conversation, but that is going to complement it, right? And to do this, we really break down the main flavors and textures in food, and then the flavors and the structures in wine. And we can pair to either the wine or we pair the wine to the food, right? So you might start from wine, you might start from food. It's not an exact science. We know that no two palates are the same. We have our own sort of cultural and regional identities when it comes to the things that we enjoy eating together. I live in a household where my partner is from Russia. I'm, born and raised in Ellensburg, Washington, and our upbringing around food were very, very different. And it's really something fun that we kind of explore and talk about together. But you might think about, there are certain cultures that enjoy stronger types of fish with maybe red wine, or they like fish with red wine because they're used to eating fishes like sardines or mackerel or anchovy that already tend to have an intensity to them, right? So they like it when red wine will intensify those flavors. We want to take into account the season, of course. We like to say when it comes to eating meat, it's kind of like we eat four-legged animals in winter and two-legged animals in summer. You also want to take into account the weather. If it's a rainy, dreary day outside, you might not be wanting to serve that scallop crudo with kind of a cold, poached pineapple on the side, right? We also want to match quality to quality. And this is also important. You don't want to spend, $65 on a steak and serve it with a $10 bottom shelf Cabernet Sauvignon that you get at the grocery store. You want to consider matching the quality of these ingredients and the quality of the occasion too, right? And what do I mean by that? The quality of the occasion, maybe you're meeting an old friend and it's COVID. So maybe you're meeting at the park for a picnic, right? This is somebody you haven't seen for a long time. Maybe you're really into wine. You want to impress them and share something really great with them. But maybe taking the 65 Obrion to a picnic where you and your friend are going to be spending so much time in conversation and catching up with each other won't really let the wine shine, right? Maybe having something like a fresh rosé or a chilled red or bubble even that are so celebratory might feel better for this particular occasion, right? And let the conversation shine. So we also consider the ambiance. It's not only about pairing wine and food, but it's really also about the moment. And it sounds cheesy, but we oftentimes say, of course, the best pairing is the people that you're with. There's nothing worse than going out to dinner, having a great meal, and not enjoying the company that you're with. So you could have the best pairing set in front of you, but you're not going to enjoy it for what it is, or maybe enjoy it at all if you're not with people that you love, enjoy, and can have great conversation with. So always think about the ambience. And conversely, of course, you could have the most simple foods, but if you're really enjoying the conversation and the people that you're with, you'll remember that experience as being great. So, who went to the farmer's market today? I did. I wish I'd taken some pictures. It was a little rainy, but not too bad. Went and checked out. This is one of my favorite times of year. I go to the Fort Greene Farmers Market really almost every Saturday morning, unless there's a reason that I can't. And I love, especially this time of year, because for so many months over the winter, the selection has been the same, right? And there comes to a point that I'm like, I just can't look at another squash. Like I can't do it, right? We've been cooking squashes, we've been roasting and braising and searing and using a cast iron pan for months now because I really like, warm, comforting foods in winter. I really like using my oven to help keep the house warm as well without having to turn the heat up. In my house, sometimes you turn the heat all the way up and it's still cold. So it's really nice to go to the market this time of year and you begin to see all this color, right? You begin to see all these colors of green. You see flowers. I saw rhubarb today, asparagus. We saw chives, ramps, fresh radishes, spring peas, all of these things were really fantastic. Some fresh lettuces, red leaf, green leaf lettuces that were really beautiful. And I brought a lot of these things home to enjoy. Something else that was at the market today, which was really cool, was soft shell crab. So we're also moving into crab season as well. So we'll talk a little bit about those pairings too. But you certainly see things like even certain mushrooms that are seasonal, morel mushrooms, things like broccoli and cauliflower we're seeing this time of year as well. You might see artichokes. I think I mentioned the asparagus. These are kind of herbaceous and green vegetables. Something else that's really different about these vegetables is the preparation that we might begin to use to cook them, right? So we talked about already the winter preparations of cooking, braising, stewing, searing, roasting, anything that uses a lot of heat and oftentimes caramelizes and brings out the sugar of these kind of winter vegetables, right? Now, soon we'll be moving into summer. The spring, especially in New York, always seems like such a brief time. And we'll be seeing a lot of those kind of green colors that we're noticing, a little bit of pink and red, purple flowers that we're noticing at the market turn more colorful. We begin to see red tomatoes, yellow tomatoes, heirloom tomatoes. We begin to see more fruit. I haven't seen strawberries yet at the market, but we'll certainly by then see our strawberries, blueberries. We begin to see our peaches, watermelons, cherries in the summer, eggplant. We can make some eggplant parm or baba ganoush or smoke that. Corn. I cannot wait for corn season. This is something that Artem does not understand. He does not understand the American obsession with corn. But then this last summer when I was able to prepare corn for him, where you don't even, I mean, you barely even have to cook fresh corn, right? Like I dip it in a pot of boiling water for, maybe a minute at most. And sometimes we even just make a fresh corn salad where we cut the kernels off of the cob. And now he really understands the obsession, but he'd never had before kind of this really fresh corn straight from the market. We move into summer squashes, yellow squash, zucchini, and then of course those radishes too. So what are we going to do with all of these things? Most of these, we don't really need a lot of preparation for. As I kind of mentioned with the corn on the cob or cutting raw kernels off of the cob. When it comes to preparing spring and summer vegetables, less is more, right? They have this incredible sweetness to them when they're in season. Sometimes we might want to use a quick cooking method, maybe pan sear or toss something. Just want to make sure we don't have a question here. If you have a question, you can certainly take yourself off mute or feel free to, I just went ahead and muted everybody just in case, but take yourself off mute or just pop it into the chat box. And I'm going to try to keep an eye on that. All right. So we're changing the preparation methods that we use for these vegetables during the spring and summer, right? They're fresh, they're crisp. We don't need to add texture through, any of these cooking preparations. We don't need to add a lot of flavor in terms of salt or seasoning as well. The vegetables we want to enjoy almost as natural as they come. What else happens in spring and summer? Rosé season. Now, is it called rosé season because this is the only time we can enjoy rosé throughout the year? Of course not. Most of us enjoy rosé all year long. We know that there are a lot of styles of rosé that are actually better suited for the colder months. But it is rosé season because this is when we see the first release of the rosés coming from the previous vintage. So April, sometimes even as early as March, but usually starting in April, May, and June, we begin to see the release of rosés. So that would include rosés coming from France. Loire Valley is kind of the queen or king of rosé production in France. So much rosé comes from the Loire in dry, off-dry, and semi-sweet styles. Of course, we think about Provence for these really light, beautiful, slightly herbal styles of wine. And when you think about Provence, what should you be eating with these styles of Provençal wines? Anything that comes from the region. You want to think about these olives, right? You want to think about octopus can be really fantastic. Sardines, fresh seafood, all of these things can be fantastic. You might think about rosé coming from Tavel in the Southern Rhone. Maybe you want something a little bit richer. You're thinking about chocolate rosé coming from the Basque region. Emma Torre is a favorite producer of ours. You might like a richer style with a little more ripeness coming from Navarra. You also think about Rosato from Italy, Chiaretto and Cerasuolo also tend to be your deeper colors. These are rosé wines that can really transition into the colder months when you want to continue to drink rosé during that time too. We know a lot of rosé comes out of California. Most of it's not blush, and most of it today is incredibly high quality. When it does move into the warmer months, we tend to begin to consume more white wine, right? Now we're discarding more clothes. We're moving from coats to sweaters, and soon we'll be moving from sweaters to tank tops. And we see our wines lighten as well. We tend to drink wines that have less makeup, right? Again, just like what we were doing with our food preparation during the winter, we're using a little bit less oak. We're looking for wines that are lower in alcohol. I think this is for a couple of reasons. One, it's warmer. Alcohol sometimes can affect us quicker, especially if we're drinking in the sun or outdoor at a barbecue or a picnic. I mean, I also think though that it's the difference of how long the sun is up, right? You think about that day in December, one of the darkest days of the year, and you come home and it's 6:30 from work and you have a glass of, big red wine, Zinfandel or Cabernet or Sangiovese on the couch or with dinner. Well, then it's time for bed, right? Like, what are you going to really stay up for, so late during the winter? But when it comes to 6:30 p.m. in the middle of June, your day could almost just be starting because it's going to be light for another 4 hours or so. You might decide to have something that's a little fresher, lower in alcohol, that will allow you to enjoy the remainder of the evening and the sunlight a little bit longer. We tend to serve these wines a little bit cooler as the weather warms up. In general, we like to say the fuller bodied a wine, the warmer of a temperature it can be served at. So for example, a really crisp, light white wine like Sancerre should always be at a colder temperature than a richer, Russian River Valley Chardonnay. The warmer, the fuller bodied the wine, the warmer the temperature. Reds also shed their winter weight. We can serve a lot of red wine chilled if they don't have a lot of tannin. We like lower tannin wines, the ones that aren't as astringent during the summer months. And we also want our reds to be lighter in alcohol. So we tend to look more toward kind of cooler climate wines, lower in tannin, a little bit lighter in body. They go better with the bounty of spring and summer food. But also, again, we're not thinking about drinking, necessarily a 15.5% oaked Cabernet Sauvignon at our afternoon picnic, right? A little bit too much alcohol, a little bit too much color on the teeth. You don't have these big, rich meals necessarily to have it with, but maybe you're having a big steak that afternoon. So we'll talk about that too. We want to talk about the overall comparison of a component, of food and wine. And this is where I think we really do you a great service, is rather than, again, telling you to have X wine with X food, it's telling you why these things work and allowing you to make these choices and decisions and to experiment at home. So one, we look at the structure. In wine, this is the body, which is a combination of the alcohol, the acidity, the sugar, and the tannin. Wines with no tannin and a lot of acidity are lighter in body. Wines with sugar are richer in body. We don't really see a lot of wines with sugar unless they're kind of off-dry styles of Riesling or Chenin Blanc, which are great with food, by the way, or dessert style wines. Something that has a lot of tannin and a lot of alcohol, like that Malbec or that Cabernet Sauvignon, will also have a much fuller body. We want to think about the main components of the dish. Is it sweet? Is it sour? Is it bitter, salty? Is it fatty? Does it have umami, that soy sauce, that dried mushroom characteristic to it? We want to consider the texture of both the food and the wine. Food can be chewy. It can be crunchy. Wine can be silky. It can have sprit to it. Of course, like sparkling wine or chocolate or vino verde. We think about fattiness in food, and we can have a brininess in both food and wine. So a lot of times we want to consider, are we matching these components, or are we attempting to contrast these components? Like we might do with something that is a off-dry wine, a little bit of sweetness with a salty food, right? Maybe a salty schnitzel with your Riesling Cabernet would be a really classic pairing. And you want to think about the cooking techniques. A caramelized scallop is very different than a scallop crudo, and you would serve those with a different style of wine, right? That caramelized scallop might have some butter or some sauce to go with it, have a sweetness. You would probably serve that with a Chardonnay, something that's a little bit buttery, maybe has seen oak, that has a little bit of those caramelized flavors to it. That Chardonnay would overwhelm a scallop crudo, right? With a little bit of kind of pickled gooseberry on the side or something like that. You want something high acid and bright and sharp and crisp to match that. So we might think about a Sancerre, as we mentioned before. We might consider a dry Riesling would be really fantastic. Something like Verdicchio coming from Italy, or even Gruner Veltliner. We think a lot about tartare during the summer months, crudité for the same reason, these fresh vegetables that don't need a lot of preparation to them. And then we kind of turn to the flamethrowers, right? We grill things, we barbecue, we have clam bakes, we have pit roast. And all of these things change the flavor of the protein that we might be enjoying, or the vegetable. So really important to consider not just what is the protein, but how are you cooking it, right? It's not enough to just say a chicken. We want to know how you're cooking it and what type of sauce you're serving with it. So we'll talk about some of the classic rules for food and wine pairing, of course. Acidity. This is the most important thing in wine. If you're drinking a white wine, let's all just take a sip. I've been talking a lot. I'm parched. So let's just have a sip of white wine. What's the first thing that happens after you've swallowed your sip? For me, it's that my palate is salivating. It's noticing the level of acidity in the wine, and my body and my palate are reacting to that, right? So acidity is incredibly important when it comes to food and wine pairing. One, it's what keeps wine tasting fresh. This is what gives it a fresh crispness, right? It needs to match or exceed the acidity of our food. Typically, we like to say that cool climate, or often old world or European wines, tend to retain more acidity, both for whites and for red, but especially whites. This is a cooler climate. The natural grape acidity stays high in the grape. So when we make wine from that, it also stays high. If we were having a Chardonnay from Chablis, the very cool region, we have a lot of that tart green apple flavor, a lot of acidity. We take Chardonnay and we plant it in, again, Russian River Valley, the much warmer climate, especially if we're further inland, you have diminished acidity and a richer palate, right? So we want to think about matching the acidity of wine to our food. We tend to think about, again, with these spring and summer vegetables, a lot of tart things to go with them. We might be whipping up maybe just a little bit of olive oil and vinegar, right? Have that acidity to it. We might be making a vinaigrette with lemon or lime, some type of citrus that we might be getting probably at the grocery store during the summer. We're kind of moving out of the citrus season at the moment. We also use acidity to decrease the perception of salt in our food. And this is incredibly important, right? Did you over season or over salt your food? You can add a little lemon to it to counteract that saltiness in the food. So we can use a high acid wine, Chablis, Muscadet, Champagne, Verdicchio, Vermentino, Sauvignon Blanc, these high acid wines to counterbalance the saltiness. This is why we often recommend these styles of wine with seafood towers and shellfish. What else do you get on your seafood tower? What else do you get with your oysters? usually a couple of slices of lemon to squeeze over that to counteract the saltiness, right? We can use wine. Don't pour the wine over your oysters, eat the oyster and drink your wine. It refreshes the palate if you're having food that have a lot of flavor or richness to them. Acidity cut through greasy and fried food. So same idea. What do you have when you have your fried artichokes? You have a lemon on the side. You squeeze that lemon on it, cut through the richness of the grease and the fried food. Acidity is also a highlighter pen. It highlights those really kind of fresh, focal ingredients in food. And it can also be a great balance to sugar. So particularly in wine, when you have a wine like we see here, this is a Riesling Spätlese coming from Weißer Künstler. They're located in the Mosel in Germany. This has some sweetness to it, but it's balanced because there's still enough acidity to balance out that sweetness, just like lemonade. When it comes to residual sugar in wine, this is natural sugar. We're not adding it afterward to make the wine sweet. This means we haven't taken all of that natural grape sugar and fermented it into alcohol. So off-dry styles of wine during the summer are some of my favorite. One, they go great with a lot of different types of food. Again, in the summer, maybe we start to make salads with fruit, right? Maybe you're making a big fruit salad as part of your brunch tomorrow. What can you have with that? You can have a Riesling with great acidity and a little bit of sweetness to go with that. Riesling can go from your spicy lunch into your dessert with a little bit of sweetness. But we like the sweetness in wine to match or exceed the sweetness that we see in food. Sugar also counterbalances heat or spice. So for example, if you are a fan of a lot of different types of Asian cuisine, Chinese, Korean, some Japanese, I don't see as much spice in Japanese cuisine personally, but I could be wrong because I've never lived in Japan and I eat what I find here. But the different cultures where we tend to see a spiciness in the food, it really is balanced nicely with a little bit of sweetness in wine. So that could be Riesling, that could be Chenin Blanc, that could be an off-dry Gewürztraminer coming from somewhere like Alsace as well. And I love sugar and salt. Like my favorite thing, if you're a fan of like, pretzels, salted pretzel, then Nutella. If you like cookie dough ice cream, that's salty and sweet, right? If you like kettle corn, you like that salty and sweet balance that you might get. It's one of my personal favorites when it comes to food. So I like having an off-dry Riesling with maybe some pork that has a little saltiness to it as well. Again, that off-dry Riesling, that schnitzel, they're really great together. Which kind of goes back into, of course, which we haven't mentioned yet, is by default, if it grows together, it usually goes together because over centuries, cuisine and wine have evolved together in the region that they're known to come from. So if you're thinking, gosh, I don't know what to have with pizza, you might be considering, well, maybe Italian wine goes really well with pizza. If you're thinking, well, gosh, I don't know what to have with razor clams, think about a wine that comes from an area where you might get a lot of razor clam, something like Albarino, something like Vino Verde, something like Chocolat, right? Something like Muscadet from France. We also want to make sure that we match the body of the food and wine. If you have that kind of dry Riesling or an off-dry Riesling with a really fatty cut of meat, the meat will overwhelm the wine and it will make your wine taste kind of bland and flabby, right? And it works the other way as well. If you're thinking of having that scallop crudo with a Cabernet Sauvignon with alcohol and oak, that wine will really overwhelm that crudo. The crudo will not taste as good as it could by comparison. So be careful. You want to make sure that the body of the wine and the food really match. And if the wine is lighter embodied, it does need to have quite a bit of flavor to it, or maybe that acidity to be able to stand up to the food. Alcohol, lower alcohol wines tend to match better with more styles of food. Alcohol can balance the weight in food. This is why we do prefer higher alcohol wine, things like Zinfandel or Grenache or Cabernet Sauvignon or Malbec, to go with richer, fattier cuts of meat, right? They can go with barbecue, they can go with burger, they can go with a porterhouse as well. Maybe if we're thinking about preparing our vegetables on the grill, maybe taking a broccoli rabe or broccolini or broccoli in general, and or radicchio, and we think about putting that on the grill, that has a lot of flavor, it's intense, and we might think about pairing that with a more intense red wine. If you have spicy food, that spice or that heat is also exaggerated by alcohol. So again, spicy food, I mentioned that off-dry Riesling, you have the sugar to counterbalance it, but because off-dry Riesling has sweetness, it's lower in alcohol, right? Because not all of that sugar became alcohol in the wine. We need to be careful with salt, of course, but salt can soften tannins, that really drying or astringent sensation that you tend to get on the palate with especially red wines. It can also go well with sweet or fruity foods. We know this. Oak in wine, I like to say that oak in wine is like salt in food. It's best in small doses. And when we salt our food, we salt food to make food taste good, not to make food taste salty. And we want to use oak the same way. Oak should be used to make wine taste good, not to make wine taste oaky. So oak can also offset some cooking techniques, but you might like the flavors of oak with certain cooking techniques as well. Oak tends to add a little bit of a caramelized character to a wine, right? We say vanilla, we say baking spice, we say butterscotch often as well. So we can imagine having this kind of oak flavor with caramelized styles of food. And I certainly don't mean, caramel itself, but we're thinking about that scallop that's been kind of cooked or pan-seared and it's caramelized on the outside. We also think about fruits, herbs, vegetables, spices, and nuts. Maybe you want to mirror flavors. Zinfandel has a little 5-spice flavor to it. Maybe you might consider having that with a little bit of kind of a Chinese 5-spice or Asian food, or maybe something with a little bit of kind of Moroccan or Middle Eastern spice can match maybe a little bit of spiciness in wine as well. So last we'll talk about flavors, and then we'll start to get into some of the fun stuff of just talking about wine. We talked about the tannin already. The tannin is that drying astringent feature that you usually get in red wine. It comes from the skins of the grape, but it can also come from oak. When you take a sip of red wine and it feels like you've just had cotton or sandpaper in your mouth or on your palate, that is tannin, right? And there's a lot of foods that have tannin too. We think about olives, right? Or excuse me, not olives, I meant to say almonds. We think about almonds. Almonds have a lot of tannin to them. A raw almond is more tannic than a roasted and salted almond, because that salt is kind of softening a little bit of that tannin there, right? So we have tannin in wine. It softens protein as well. It also softens fat. So when we have something like ricotta, that you might be enjoying really fresh fatty cheese, also a great springtime cheese. You're thinking about animals that are beginning to graze on pasture as opposed to hay or grain or things like that inside of the I'm trying to think of the right word, the shed, not the shed. Where do animals say, the inside, the little, like the stall, I can't think of the word right now. Sometimes that happens. But you think about they're grazing on a lot of grain and hay during the winter season. Now they're going out to pasture, they're grazing on fresh grasses and clovers and things that are growing. And this changes the composition of their milk and the composition of cheese. We like to use this really fresh milk to make really fresh cheeses this time of year, right? So mozzarella, we might think about things like ricotta, of course. Soft ripened cheeses that are aged for a very short period of time, 30 days or less, like the camembert, where you develop a little bit of that rind because of the soft ripened cheese, but it's still really fresh, it's still really about the quality of the milk as well. So you might take that ricotta, you might have that ricotta with this Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon. You have all this fat and richness on the palate, and and the tannin in the wine just come through and break down all of that fat, right? Makes you want to have another bite of the ricotta, and then another drink of your Cabernet or your Sangiovese or your Barolo, whatever it is you might be having. We also have oils, fat, butter. Again, we use that acidity or that tannin to help balance any of these components that we might find in our particular dish. So one, we always want to think about the main ingredient. Most of us think about this as the protein, but of course now we're thinking, how is that protein being cooked? The method of production, but also think about your sauces, your condiments, and your side dishes. Sauces can really become your dominating factor in food and wine pairing, as opposed to your protein. Sometimes protein becomes kind of what I call like a neutral solid, right? If you're having an herb crusted or chimichurri crusted chicken breast, the chicken breast itself, skinless, boneless, maybe it's been, roasted in the oven, might not have as much flavor as that chimichurri sauce. So now you're not pairing chicken, you're pairing chimichurri sauce. You might be cooking cod in a cream sauce with sorrel. You want to pair that cream sauce, right? Not the cod, which is kind of a light and flaky fish, and will give away to the flavor of that cream sauce and that sorrel. You might be taking that cod and putting it in a fish taco with mango and pineapple salsa. Now with the dominating flavor of that taco, the mango and the pineapple salsa, right? So we'll think about pairing that again with something with a little sweetness and acidity. That Riesling, that off-dry Riesling is going to be perfect here. We talk a lot about Riesling, right? How are we doing so far? I see a couple things in the chat. Thank you, Sheila, for the oak, for complimenting the oak analogy. So here we have a couple of great things, right? So we have the perfect description of multiple things that work with this pairing. So we're talking about one, spring roll. They're fried. What are they filled with? Maybe they're filled with some duck, could be really great this time of year. We're dipping this into a sweet and salty Thai chili sauce. A lot of different things to pair here. One, we need something with acidity to cut through the richness of frying that paper, that wonton wrapper, right? We also need something with some sweetness and acidity to match the sweetness and acidity of this. We're in Riesling land. When in doubt, unless your food, the body of your food or the flavor of your food is going to be incredibly overwhelming, Riesling pairs with almost everything. It is really fantastic for raw foods, especially vegetables at their peak sweetness. It's great with crudo. It's great with different types of tartare, raw fishes, tuna. It can be very fantastic with spicy food. We talked about this, especially with some sweetness, lower alcohol. It matches your acidic foods like your vinaigrette. I'm sure we've all had that experience. We've gone out to dinner. We ordered a great glass or bottle of a red wine. We know it's going to go fantastic with our, rack of lamb that we ordered for dinner. But first you get a side salad with vinaigrette on it. You're drinking your wine, you love it. You take a bite of your salad, that's good. You go back to take a drink of your wine and suddenly it's almost unpalatable, right? Your wine tastes, this beautiful kind of rich, luscious red wine you were just drinking now tastes tart and astringent and kind of bitter, right? So it's really nice to have a little bit of that, maybe half glass of white wine, maybe that glass of white wine that can pair well with that salad with vinaigrette at the beginning of your meal. As we move into the summer too, we think about adding fruit to a lot of our salads. So we add those blueberries, we add those apples, sometimes those strawberries to our salad during this time as well. We can also think about matching an off-dry or sweet Riesling with fruit desserts, peach melba. Maybe you just have a peach, sliced peaches for dessert. Strawberries with creme fraiche could be really fantastic. We're taming spice. These can go great with those fresh brie, triple cream cheeses, that fresh ricotta as well, because in this case, even though before we were using tannin to offset fat, now we can use acidity to offset fat. So there's not, as I mentioned before, like food and wine pairing is much more complex. It's not as binary as one thing only goes, one wine only goes with one food. There's oftentimes a lot of options, and it's really about exploring your palate to see what goes best with that. These don't tend to work with really pungent vegetables. We said it goes well with those kind of like peas and things like that. Artichokes and Brussels sprouts tend to go better with Gruner Veltliner, which we're going to talk about in a moment as well. It doesn't go as well with herb sauces. We don't typically have a lot of green flavors in Riesling. It's usually about the apple, the peach, the honey, and the floral characteristics. Red meat, especially heavier preparations, you might find a Riesling that could be really great with tartare or some type of beef crudo. But it also doesn't necessarily go great with heavy dishes with a lot of butter during this time of year either, or any time of year. Sauvignon Blanc, this is a classic, one of the most accessible wines. We love Sauvignon Blanc moving into the summer and the spring season because there are a lot of very great, inexpensive examples of it. So this is your perfect wine to pick up a bottle for under $20, to take it to the picnic, to take it to the park, to take it to the barbecue. This is a wine that tends to have more green herbaceous flavor to it. It tastes like fresh cut grass, kind of like our goat cheese does during the spring and summer, right? It tastes a little bit like green tea sometimes, maybe a little bit of jalapeno or bell pepper. It also has some slightly bright tropical fruit to it. We talk a little bit about, a lot of citrus, sometimes grapefruit when it comes to this. We get a little elderflower in this type of wine. It can be really fantastic with these vinaigrettes using citrus, especially in the dressings. It goes really well with tomatoes. Tomatoes are hard to pair, right? Tomatoes are hard to pair with white wine too, I think. I think they really have an affinity for red wine, but Sauvignon Blanc is almost like adding a little bit of basil to your tomato. Can be really fantastic with these sauces with herbs. So if you wanted to have chicken with chimichurri, Sauvignon Blanc would be a really great choice to have with that. And then the bright acidity, the citrus component naturally lends it to shellfish also. Shrimp, oysters, clams, that raw bar, that shellfish tower can be really fantastic. I like to think that other types of shellfish, things like crab and lobster, that we would more traditionally dip in butter, are usually better with a slightly buttery wine, which we're going to talk about next. Again, we don't really enjoy this crisp white wine with red meats, so we try to stay away from the heavier preparations of burgers or lamb or steaks. Because it's dry and crisp, it does not pair well with sweet sauces or fruit accompaniment to meat like Riesling does, right? We don't want to really have this one necessarily with just our kind of applesauce on the side with our pork chop. We're going to do a little bit better to have that cabinet Riesling or that kind of fruity Riesling to go with that. And just like Riesling, Sauvignon Blanc does not have an affinity for butter. But what does? We know the answer to this one, Chardonnay. We think about this buttery character that we tend to get in Chardonnay due to the way that it's often made in the winery. It tends to be a little bit more malleable for the winemaker, which is why you get such a range of expressions of Chardonnay. But that's one of the things that makes it so fun to explore. Because Chardonnay typically has this buttery character to it, we can think about pairing Chardonnay with anything that we would add butter to, right? Now, I said earlier, you're kind of like your artichokes and your Brussels sprouts and your asparagus are really great with your Sauvignon Blanc. They're also really great with your Gruner Veltliner. But I also think if you have your artichoke dipped in butter, then you would probably like your artichoke with your Chardonnay, right? When we think about crab, I have as I mentioned before, soft shell crabs in the fridge from the market earlier today. Artem does the cooking, so I'm not sure exactly what he's going to do, but probably maybe serve them tempura or something like that. Maybe we'll have a little bit of a richer sparkling wine to go with that. Would be kind of nice, right? Cut through the fat of the tempura, match with the kind of creaminess of the inside of the crab as well. We think about those scallops that have been browned or caramelized as opposed to that scallop crudo, which we're going to enjoy with Riesling. It can go with full flavored fishes. We can think about salmon. We can think about tuna. If we're having our buttery sauces, we're thinking about, you can't get the kid to eat anything but noodles with butter and you don't have the energy to make yourself something else. You can still have an adult dinner by pouring yourself a glass of Chardonnay to go with your butter noodles, right? We can think about poached meat. This is a white wine that can go with steak because it has that richer body. Again, we're pairing body and body. Oak and that buttery character add body. We can think about adding that to steak. Popcorn, that corn that we're going to have. What do we put on popcorn? What do we put on corn? If you have not snuck a bottle of Chardonnay into the movie theater to have with your popcorn, I highly recommend it. But maybe you didn't hear that from me based on what the laws are in your local state. But you know, a bottle of Chardonnay doesn't have to be expensive, can be really nice to go with that popcorn. Because of the richness, it doesn't go quite as well with raw fish or lighter foods or spicier dishes. Chardonnay is a wine that usually sees, or oftentimes, but not always, sees oak, unlike Riesling, and usually unlike Sauvignon Blanc. There are oaked examples of Sauvignon Blanc, Fumé Blanc coming from California, Passac Léognan or White Bordeaux tend to see a little bit of oak, but usually most of the Sauvignon Blanc we think about, Chile, New Zealand, Sancerre, Puy-Fumé, are typically unoaked styles. We also don't want to have our Chardonnay with anything too delicate because that richer body again will overwhelm it. Pinot Noir, just like Riesling, if in doubt, if you're going somewhere that you don't know what's going to be served, usually Pinot Noir is one of your safest bets. It has a natural affinity for lower alcohol, lower tannin, and higher acidity. This makes it a better match with more foods. Now, if you go over to your friend's house, you don't know what they were cooking, and it turns out they're having a pit roast, the wine might be a little bit overwhelmed by the flavor than the fat of that. But in general, Pinot Noir is a great pairing wine. It seamlessly paired with both richer styles of fish, but also lighter styles of meat. It can be really fantastic with charcuterie. It can be good with tomatoes. It can go great with mushrooms because it tends to have a little bit more of an earthy character to it. It's great with those lighter cuts of meat like filet mignon that don't have as much fat. You don't need as much tannin to soften that fat as well, right? Sometimes you can even do this with shellfish. Can be really fantastic. Higher acid sauces, dressings where you might want red wine, maybe something with a little bit of cranberry on the side. Pinot Noir goes with soy sauce usually as well. It matches, again, soy sauce has that kind of umami characteristic to it, kind of like our dried mushroom, and Pinot Noir can be a good match for that. It can go great with all types of preparation of chicken, from roasted to seared to grilled, can all be really fantastic. You want to stay away from the really, really full flavored types of food, your ribeye, your porterhouse, your barbecue. You don't want to do it with sauces that don't have enough acidity, like brown butter. Keep your brown butter sauce with your Chardonnay, you'll be really happy. Or those fattier cuts of meat that might need a little bit more tannin in the wine that Pinot Noir usually can't offer. So I'm a big Syrah fan. If you're drinking the Macario Dringenberg at home, you probably noticed that this is a peppery wine. If you were blinding this, you might be like, wow, it's really light in color, but it smells a little bit like Syrah because of that peppery character, right? Which we'll get into in a moment. But Syrah is one of my favorite wines. I love it, especially to pair with food because it's a wine that tastes like food. It has a smoky character. It has a meatiness to it that usually translates well to food that it's being paired with, especially when that food is grilled. when that food has black pepper or white pepper, when we're talking about charred meats or burgers. I love this as a backyard barbecue style of wine because Syrah is usually lighter in alcohol and lighter in tannin than something like Cabernet Sauvignon or something like Malbec. So this is that wine, especially if it's coming from the Rhone Valley in France or cooler climate in California, like Santa Barbara or Sonoma Coast. You can bring this Syrah. It can go great with those kind of full flavored foods at a barbecue, but you're not going to get wasted because it's not going to be 16% alcohol, right? Be careful of some of those Australian Shirazes because those ones coming from the warmer climates like Barossa can definitely be higher in alcohol. They're fantastic with pork and bacon. I love this with a BLTA, right? Bacon, lettuce, tomato, avocado. Be really fantastic with olive, green, and black olive, different types. A New World or kind of warmer climate Shiraz is really great for richer sauce flavors. So you kind of see in this photo, we have the pulled pork with barbecue. And if you're thinking about some of the ingredients that go into this barbecue sauce, we're thinking about tomatoes, we're thinking about vinegar, we're thinking about brown sugar, right? It has this sweetness and this richness to it that a warmer climate Syrah or Shiraz would pair a little bit better with that spice. That barbecue sauce might be a little bit overwhelming for your Rhone Valley Syrah. So in that case, you would want to pair more of like your smoked or your charred meat that don't have your barbecue sauce with your Northern Rhone Syrah. But if you're going barbecue sauce, think warmer climate, think New World, think Australia, think South Africa, think some of those warmer climates coming from California. It's a bigger peppery red wine. You can imagine it doesn't go as well with raw fish. A really spicy dish, it won't be great with. It can be great with spiced dishes. So we think about the difference: spicy as in hot, right? Spicy on the palate, and spiced as in think of like Indian food, or spiced kebabs could be really fantastic with the Shiraz or Syrah as well. Spiced, not spicy. Cabernet. I know we're moving into spring and summer, but some of us just like to drink Cab all year round. And if you are the type of person, or you live with the type of person that has the barbecue on all year round, you probably definitely keep some Cabernet Sauvignon on hand. This is what we really want to keep to pair with our big red meats, our grilled food, right? Those bitter vegetables that we might be considering cooking on the grill. Your kind of black pepper, again here, Cabernet Sauvignon also tends to have more of an herbal element to it, especially if it's coming from a cooler climate, or a producer like Kathy Corson, who picks a little bit earlier and maintains still ripe wine, but a little bit more of those herbaceous flavors that you get with Cabernet Sauvignon. We don't want to have it with really delicate or subtle dishes. We don't want to have it with too strong of cheeses. We can certainly have it with a little bit more mild, but slightly aged and mild cheeses. We don't want to have it with spicy or hot foods. Cabernet Sauvignon, especially coming from someplace like Napa Valley, tends to be 14% alcohol or above. So that higher alcohol, we don't want to have it with these spicy food. We don't want to have it with dishes with no fat or protein. We can do it with, again, those sort of bitter or herbaceous vegetables are really good with this. Think about like stuffed peppers can be really great. Peppers stuffed with beef and rice, or just rice and vegetables as well, can be really fantastic with this Cabernet Sauvignon. And oftentimes people say that red wine and chocolate goes well together, but I really think for a kind of tannic red wine, you need to match it with a more tannic chocolate. So this would be better with dark chocolate as opposed to milk or white chocolate. But if you love that milk chocolate, you might go for something like a Zinfandel, which is like almost like pouring a fruit berry compote over your chocolate, like your molten lava cake with blackberry sauce on the side. I hope everybody has lunch plans after this. I'm sitting here, I can smell the charcuterie and the smoked mackerel on my plate, the olive and the soy sauce that I have, and talking about food this entire time definitely had me in the mood for lunch after this. So, let's see. We have just a few, I mean, not really a few moments. As I mentioned, always feel free to jump off and catch the rest on the recording. But I really hope that this kind of helped us understand the components of food and wine and how we can learn to match those together. And I think I mentioned it before, don't be afraid to experiment, because if you don't like something, that's almost a better way to learn about it than if you do like something, right? And also, if you taste something, you're like, I don't like how those go together. The only thing you have to do is taste something else. And then usually that flavor, that experience is off of your palate. Always taste your wine when you open it. I cannot stress enough, things can go wrong with the wine. Your wine can be corked. There's nothing worse, especially if you're hosting people for dinner, from chilling your white wines in the fridge, for 4 hours before your guests arrive, and pulling it out and realizing that that wine is corked. So open your wine at the beginning, test it, make sure it's not corked, taste the wine, and have an idea of what that wine is like. And because you can adjust food to go with the wine, right? Maybe it's a little bit more acidic than you thought it would be. Maybe you're going to add a little bit more lemon to whatever you're preparing, right? Maybe it's not as acidic. Maybe you'll dial back the lemon on what you're preparing. So always taste the wine, trust your palate. Your palate's always seeking balance. You naturally pair things at home by yourself all the time. Anytime you add a little lemon to counterbalance that salt, anytime you put some jelly with your peanut butter to use the acidity of jelly to counterbalance the richness of the fat in the peanut butter, you're naturally doing this. So trust your palate, experiment, and eat and drink what you like. So two wines that we didn't discuss because I wanted to save them for the end are Gruner Veltliner. This is coming from Birgit Eichinger. This is a single vineyard Premier Cru site called Lamb in the region of Kamptal. Birgit is one of the first female winemakers, not just in Kamptal, but really in all of Austria. She's pictured here with her daughter, who's beginning to take a little bit more serious hand in the winery. She helps out quite a bit. Birgit started her winery after she inherited vineyards from her parents. She's grown her vineyard land, but she's still pretty small and artisanal. They're very low yield. So if you're drinking this wine, you can see it has quite a bit of color to it. When we have lower yields, we have more intense flavors and concentration in the wine itself. And I think you really get that in this wine. You have this plum and citrus, it has a little spice and smoke to it. It has a textural element that I noticed when I took a sip of the wine earlier. And it's a little bit peppery, and it has a little bit of like almost a vegetal, like slightly radish characteristic to it in the best way possible. Sometimes we like to describe Gruner Veltliner as like minestrone soup. Like there's a little vegetal characteristic to it. There's a little bit of white pepper. It's not the most fruit forward wine. There is fruit, but this is a fantastic match again for all of those spring vegetables, those peas, those artichokes, even Brussels sprouts that were coming out of the winter season, that broccoli. This would be great with gazpacho that you're making later on in the season. And also this could go with, fresh fried or baked fish would also be really great with this. Have a little sip. That's so good. There's so much intensity of flavor here, but it's still crisp and it's still fresh and bright. It's a really, really nice wine. And as it's been sitting out, I poured this about 10 minutes before class started. It's still chilled enough, but you see a lot of flavor coming out of the wine as it's come up a little bit to temperature. So the second wine, this one would be, Gruner is pretty widely available. You can usually walk into almost any wine shop and ask for Gruner. Usually it can be pretty inexpensive. This one was a single vineyard site, so it's a little bit more expensive. I think it's like about $39 retail, but it's very easy to get a very quality style of Gruner Veltliner for $20 or under. This would be your great kind of, again, picnic wine at the beach. Can go with those salads and everything else. This one might not be as accessible, but I still love this wine, especially when we start thinking about summer and spring herbs. So also a female winemaker, Giovanna, she took over her family's estate about 20 years ago. The family had been bottling this grape, Rosacé, since the early 70s. It's genetically linked to a grape called Tiburon or Tiburon, coming from Provence. It's an ancient grape variety. It's one of the grapes used to make our favorite Provence rosé, which is called Clos Cibone. So this is actually the same grape, but here we're growing it on the Ligurian coast of Italy. These are incredibly old vines. You can see a picture of how they look down here. It's really quite incredible. They're worked by hand. These are very steep slopes. Mechanization is impossible. So the production is very small. This is a wine that's aged entirely in stainless steel, which is why you retain so much of that kind of fresh fruit and peppery characteristic of this wine. And I love, love, love this red wine to go with both tomatoes. It has enough acidity for a red wine. Margarita pizza, right? That cheese, that tomato sauce, that basil. Pesto sauce, especially from fresh basil as we get into that season at the market. You want to have pasta with pesto. You want to have caprese. This is the perfect wine to counterbalance all of those flavors that you might get. I really love this one. Any comments from those that have the wines? When I drink it, it has this intensity, this peppery characteristic on the palate. I really, really love this wine. It's still sharp enough. It's in its acidity, which is what makes it so beautiful for all of these spring and summertime vegetables coming up as well. How are we doing? Any questions? Are you hungry? I hope everybody is hungry. It's time to have lunch. As always, it's a great pleasure to see everyone. We have all friends on the call today, which is always really fun. If you do have questions, of course, we'd love to hear from you. Please don't hesitate to reach out. We want to hear about what you're making for dinner, what you're going to pair with it. And as always, you know, it's not supposed to be hard and it's not supposed to cause anxiety. It's supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be about eating and drinking with the people that we care about and having a good time. Thank you, everybody. Let me know if you have questions.
This was so great. Thank you so much. I'm so glad I did it. Can you guys try and have more daytime classes for me?
We will. I'll bring it up. I'll bring it up.
That'd be great. All right. Bye.
Thanks, Sheila.
Great class.
See you guys soon.
Bye.
Happy Mother's Day to all the moms out there. Have a great Saturday, everybody.